Wolf 4. Tighten your seatbelts. Phil Bishop pushed the nose of the seaplane down through the thick clouds, and the twins found themselves above a large expanse of blue-gray water. There, Marty pointed. In the distance was a fur-covered island shrouded in mist. You don't suppose Uncle Travis has the island all to himself? Grace ignored the question. She leaned forward and tapped Bertha on the shoulder. There's somebody in the small kayak down there. What are you talking about, dear? A kayak. It's red. Bertha looked over at Phil, and they both scanned the surface of the water through the windshield. I don't see a thing, Bertha said. I don't see anything either, Phil added. No one owns a kayak on the island, and it's more than 100 miles from the nearest landfall. No kayaker in his right mind would be that far from shore. If Grace says there's a kayak, Marty said, there's a kayak. Grace had eyes like an eagle. Bertha looked at Phil. If she's right, the kayaker is in big trouble. It wouldn't hurt to look. Phil sighed, dipped the left ring, and started circling. A few minutes later, Bertha pointed and said, I see it. Grace was right. Phil looked, then said something that would have gotten him expelled from the Omega Opportunity Preparatory School. He spoke into the microphone on his headset. The twins could not hear what he was saying, but they assumed he was calling for assistance. 5 minutes later, they were skimming the relatively smooth water of the island's sheltered bay. As they taxied toward the shore, they passed a concrete dock with a large rusty ship moored to it. The ship was called the Coelacanth. Maybe they'll use the Coelacanth to rescue the kayaker, Marty said, pronouncing the name Coelacanth. Grace shook her head. It's pronounced Coelacanth. I knew that, Marty said, his usual response to something he did not know. What's a coelacanth? I think it's a fish, Grace answered. But they won't be using that ship to rescue anyone. It doesn't look seaworthy, and it's too big. But they could use that, Marty pointed to the helicopter sitting on the forward deck. I suppose they could, Grace agreed. But the helicopter didn't look much better than the ship it was on. Phil docked the seaplane, then climbed out and began tying it down. When it was secured, Bertha jumped out of the cockpit, and the twins clambered out after her. What about the kayaker? Marty asked. Don't worry, we'll get him, Phil answered, then turned to Bertha. Why don't you run them up to the fort? We can bring the luggage and groceries up later. Fort? Marty asked. You'll see. Bertha led them to a gravel lot above the dock, where a lone vehicle was parked. Wow, Marty said. It's a Humvee. The blocky four-wheel drive was painted in desert camouflage and looked like it had been rolled a time or two. He ran ahead and gave it a quick going over. When Bertha and Grace joined him, he pointed at a line of large holes across the driver's door. What are these? Bullet holes, Bertha said. .50 caliber. No kidding. We have several Humvees on the island, Bertha explained. Your uncle got them from the army. They're not much to look at, but once you get them started, they'll go just about anywhere. A lot of our equipment is military surplus. Maybe Wolf is one of those paramilitary paranoids, Racco types, Grace whispered. Have you ever thought of that? You're the one that's paranoid, Marty answered. You think so? She pointed to a huge sign at the front of the parking lot with 3-foot-tall red letters. No trespassing. Electronic surveillance. Trespassers will be shot. That does seem a bit extreme, Marty admitted. What's that, dear? Bertha asked. I was just wondering about the sign, he said. We are very security conscious here. Why? There are things on the island that... Bertha hesitated. Well, your uncle will explain everything when you see him. Is there a town on the island? Marty asked. Heavens no, Bertha said. This is your uncle's island. The whole thing? The whole shebang. Bertha got into the front seat of the Humvee. Marty looked at Grace. I guess your theory about him wanting our inheritance is down the tubes. Owning an island doesn't mean he's not hurting for money. And what about my paramilitary Racco theory? What about the fort? You look great in camouflage fatigues, Marty said, and climbed into the front seat next to Bertha. Grace got in the back. The veteran Humvee coughed and shook, but finally came to a roaring start. Before Bertha engaged the clutch, she reached into the glove box and pulled out 2 silver chains with square pieces of colored plastic hanging on them. She gave the blue one to Grace and the gray one to Marty. What are these? Grace asked. Identification. Bertha pulled out a green tag from the neck of her dress. We all wear them here. The twins looked at the tags. They were blank on both sides. I don't understand, Marty said. Let me guess, Grace said. Uncle Travis will explain it to us when we see him. That's right. Just put them on for now, and don't take them off. That's one of the rules of the island. What are some of the other rules? Marty asked. Don't wander around the island unless one of us is with you. At least for the time being. If you think you shouldn't be doing something, ask before you do it. Never complain about my cooking. Have fun and... Well, I'm sure we'll come up with some more rules as time passes. We've never had children here before. She stepped on the gas, sending up a spray of gravel. The twins weren't able to see much on the way up to their uncle's house because Bertha drove the Humvee as if she were trying to outrun a forest fire. The narrow, winding road was a blur of green trees. They crossed the bridge and took a hard right onto another road, which led them up a steep hill at the top. Bertha brought the Humvee to a skidding stop in front of the 3-story house made out of moss-covered stone blocks. Parked in front of the house was another Humvee identical to the one they were in, without the bullet holes. Your uncle's inside, Bertha said. I'm going back down to give Phil a hand. The twins got out and Bertha drove away as fast as she had arrived. Grace and Marty stood very quietly for a moment and took in their surroundings. It needs a good pressure washing, Marty said, or a stone mason. but it does look like a fort. More like a haunted castle, Grace said, knowing that about the only thing that spooked her brother was ghosts. I have a very bad feeling about all this. I bet it's filled with zombies and ghouls. Marty did his best to ignore her. He did not want to think about ghosts and haunted castles. The house sat on a high promontory. Strong winds and a salt air had worn away the stonework. To the west was a sheer cliff and an endless span of water, with drifting patches of fog above it. Boy, would I love to hang glide off that, he said. To the east was a thick forest of trees. On the far side of the island was a massive hill covered with several right spinning windmills. What do you suppose those are for? He asked. Wind turbines, Grace answered, to generate electricity. I knew that, Marty said, and turned his attention back to the house. There were dozens of windows with stone balconies. The slate roof was covered with antennas and several satellite dishes of different sizes. He must get every TV station on Earth, Marty said. At the boarding school, they had not been allowed to watch much television, and when they did, they could only watch shows that Dr. Beazle had previewed and approved. The front door is wide open, Grace said, but there's nobody here to greet us. Don't you think that's a little strange, Marty? Marty did think it was a bit odd, but before he could respond, a very large raven flew through the front door and headed right toward them. Watch out! He tackled Grace and tried to cover her as best he could. The bird veered away from them at the last second. It circled the house twice, gaining altitude with each loop, then flapped out to sea, making a deep croaking sound like a crow with a bad cold. Sorry about that. Marty helped Grace up, a little embarrassed at his overreaction. I thought the bird was going to. No, it's perfectly all right, Grace interrupted him. Her brother's gallantry and quick wits were two of his best traits, and she wouldn't think of criticizing either. Even though he had knocked her down and she had scraped her knee. Now that was strange, Marty said. Why would Uncle Travis have a raven in his house? Maybe it was feeding on a corpse, Grace said, brushing herself off. Marty shuddered, then walked up onto the porch and knocked on the door jamb. Uncle Travis, it's Marty and Grace. There was no response. Now what? Grace asked. I guess we go in. Hesitantly, they walked through the doorway and found themselves in a large entry hall. To the right was a wide staircase, to the left a closed set of doors, and directly in front of them a long dark hallway. Whew, Marty said. Smells a little musty in here. Like a dungeon, Grace said. Look, in the corner was a pile of duffel bags and backpacks. Off to the side was a roll of mosquito netting, coils of climbing rope, and sword clothing. Looks like Uncle Travis just got back, Marty said. Grace held up a vest. The bottom of it almost touched the floor. And he's a giant. Marty picked up a huge cotton glove with holes in it. Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. You're not funny. Come on. He walked down the hallway, which led to an enormous dining room with a table that was at least 20 feet long. Looks like we're having newsprint for dinner, he said. Stacked on top of the table was pile after pile of old yellowed newspapers. Grace started going through them. Most of these are trashy supermarket papers. I guess he likes to keep on top of current events, Marty said. Grace picked one up and read the headliner. Vampires suck small Texas town dry. See what I mean? I'm getting scared, Marty. Marty was feeling a little nervous himself, but he wasn't about to admit it. He led Grace into the next room. Whoa, he said. Now this is what I call a kitchen. There was an ancient oven, an enormous grill, a walk-in freezer, a commercial refrigerator, a huge butcher block that looked like 1,000 cows had been carved up on it, and dozens of iron skillets and pans dangling from the ceiling. It was a far cry from the modern kitchen at school. But with a good cleaning and some organization, Marty thought it would do nicely. They walked through a swinging door and found themselves in a living room that ran the entire length of the house, floor to ceiling. Windows jutted out beyond the cliff's edge. Grace looked out at the thick fog. It feels as if you're floating above the ocean here, she said. Look, there's the kayak. Marty pointed to a red dot still some distance from shore. And the helicopter. It swooped in and hovered over the small boat. That kayaker is lucky you saw him. He'd be shark bait by now. They watched until a curtain of fog blocked their view. Marty wandered away from the window and started looking around the room. It was filled with mismatched but comfortable-looking chairs and sofas. The floor was covered with a threadbare oriental carpet. Hanging on the walls were old oil paintings, which Marty found particularly interesting. Assorted tribal masks, shields, spears, swords, and several stone gargoyles, taken from old buildings. Standing next to the fireplace was a full suit of armor that looked as though it had been pushed off a cliff. I guess Uncle Travis is an antique collector, Marty said. Or he spends his weekends at garage sales. On an island. Marty walked over to the plasma screen television on the far side of the room. The screen was covered with a thick dust. Do you really think Mom and Dad intended for us to live on an island in the middle of nowhere with a man we've never met before? Grace asked. Marty wrote his name in the dust on the screen. It's not that bad, Grace. It just needs a good cleaning. You missed my point. What else is new? Come on. Grace followed him back to the entry hall. Upstairs or through the double doors. Marty pushed them open and they were hit with a blast of warm, mildewed air. The warmth came from a blazing fireplace at the far end of an immense room. The mildew smell came from above. Circling the room was a balcony lined with books. A spiral staircase to the left of the door led up to it. I guess you didn't have to bring those books after all, Marty commented. Running along the wall to the right of the room was a laboratory bench covered with beakers, Bunsen burners, test tubes, and a microscope, a magnifying light, and other paraphernalia. Perhaps Uncle Travis is a mad scientist. Marty did his best impressions of Frankenstein's monster. Grace was not amused. You're as frightening as I am, she said. You always joke around when you're scared. Oh, please, Marty said. But he knew she was right. He walked over to the stone fireplace, which was big enough to do jumping jacks in. On either side of it were large aquariums, and in one were two of the ugliest fish he had ever seen. They were about 4 feet long and were covered with large metallic blue scales that looked like armor plating. What are they? Grace wandered over behind him. I'm not sure. Well, that's the first. Marty moved over to the second aquarium. Even I know what these are. Grace joined him and watched the 10-legged creatures darting around the artificial reef. What kind of person would keep a school of squid in his library? Her question was answered by a high-pitched barking. A moment later, a tiny black dog dashed into the room. It tried to stop when it reached them, but slipped on the slick floor and slid 10 feet past where they were standing. A pink identification tag hung from its tiny collar. What is it? Marty asked. A dog, you dunce. It sounds like a dog, but it looks like a curly black squirrel without a tail. Welcome to Crypto's Island, a deep voice boomed behind them. Grace and Marty jumped, then looked in the direction of the voice, and saw a very large man framed in the doorway, leaning on a cane. He had long black unkempt hair and a bushy black beard. Marty whispered to Grace, "That's the kind of man who keeps the squids in his library. He is a pirate," Grace thought, just as Bertha said. The only thing missing is a black eye patch and a bloody cutlass. She felt herself go faint and put a hand on Marty's shoulder. "You okay?" Marty asked. "I'm not sure," she answered weakly. "Stay close." The man walked over to them. His eyes were the same shade of brown as their mother's, but there was something wild and unsettling about them. He was dressed in baggy cargo pants, slippers, and a thick black sweater. Around his neck he wore a tag like the ones Brother had given them, but his was turquoise. "Uncle Travis?" Marty asked. The man nodded. "But please call me Wolf. Everyone does." The tiny dog started running circles around the group, yapping frantically. "Stop that! Nonsense, PD." The dog obediently sat down in front of him, panting with a tongue no bigger than a pinky finger. "You would better get used to these kids. They've come to live with us." He held his cargo pocket open and said, "Snake." To the twins' amazement, the dog jumped into his pocket, then poked its head out for one last defiant yap before disappearing. "I'm sorry for all the confusion," Wolf apologized. "Bertha and Phil probably already told you, but I just got back, and I wasn't able to get things ready the way I wanted. And now we have this kayaker problem." "Did you get him?" Marty asked. "Yes, good." Marty pointed at his uncle's pocket. "What kind of dog is he?" "It's a teacup poodle, and it's a she, not a he." "PD is an odd name." Hearing her name, the dog poked her head back out of the pocket and gave another yap. "Short for pocket dog." Wolf explained, "We were in the desert, looking around one day, and she ran into a rattlesnake. There was no place to hide, so she hopped into my pocket. She's been doing it ever since." "All you have to say is snake?" "That's right." Let's get some more light in here. He turned on a lamp next to the sofa. When he turned back to them, a look of astonishment crossed his rugged face. "What is it?" Grace asked. Wolf closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, and stammered, "Nothing. I guess I'm more tired than I thought. We just flew in this morning, and I've been—" "There you are." Bertha came into the library with her arms full of groceries. She set the bags down and walked over to Wolf. Sorry to interrupt, but Phil needs to talk to you right away." "Of course. I'll see you both at dinner," Wolf said, hurriedly, obviously relieved at the interruption. "In the meantime, Bertha will show you to your rooms so you can get some rest. You must be tired after your long flight." He rushed out of the room with PD still in his pocket. Bertha picked up the bags and said she would show them their rooms. After she put the groceries in the kitchen, Marty started to follow her, but Grace held him back. "What was that about?" she asked. "Did you see the way Uncle Wolf, looked at me?" "I thought he was looking at me," Marty said. "He wasn't, and he sure seemed to get over his exhaustion quickly. He didn't just leave the library, he fled from it." Marty shrugged his shoulders. "It must have been an emergency. Wasn't the pocket dog great?" Grace was more interested in pursuing their uncle's peculiar behavior. "Don't change the subject." "I'm not," Marty said. "By the way, what does cryptos mean?" "I think it comes from the Greek word kryptos." Bertha came back in. "Are you ready?" "Sure," Marty said. Grace caught him by the sleeve. "The word means hidden," she whispered. The Gizmo. 5. Marty was tired, but far too excited to rest. His bedroom was much bigger than the one he had shared with Luther at the boarding school. It had a king-size bed, a television, and a private bathroom. No more running down the hallway trying to avoid painful towel snaps from the older boys. He wasn't happy about the circumstances that had brought him to Cryptos, but he was pleased with the island, the squid, the bedroom, and the house, even though it was a little spooky. In the corner of the bedroom was a desk. On top of it was something about the size and shape of his Game Boy, which he had lost to Luther in a bet. "Marty, the computer's yours. We call it a gizmo. Enjoy. Wolf." It was the smallest computer Marty had ever seen. He carried it over to the bed, flipped open the cover, and pressed a button beneath the little screen. The computer booted up and 8 icons appeared: GPS, teleconference, email, keyboard, locate, chat, video, and cybervault. Marty found a stylus attached to the underside of the cover. He took it out and tapped the keyboard icon, and a small keyboard appeared on the screen. Cool. He tried the teleconference and chat icons, but nothing happened. He skipped the email icon, figuring it wouldn't work without an email account, and clicked the cybervault icon. "To establish vault, please insert your disk." "Don't have a disk," Marty said. He clicked the video icon. The screen went blank for a second, then filled with an aerial image of the coelacanth. He saw Phil's seaplane still tied to the dock. Then the camera swooped across open water. They must be using the helicopter to film this, Marty thought. But why? The camera circled back around and passed over the top of the red kayak. It was now resting safely on the beach, which he was glad to see. The camera plunged downward over the parking lot, where Marty caught a glimpse of Phil and the back of another person, getting into a Humvee. A moment later, the Humvee drove away and the camera followed it up the road for a while, then veered off into the trees and rose above them. The tops of fir trees flashed across the screen. In the distance, he could just make out two small lakes with a last glimmer of orange sunlight reflecting off the surface. Video terminated. The 7 icons reappeared. Marty whistled. The computer we built can't do that. Wait until I tell Luther. He clicked the locate icon. What do you want to locate? Wolf, Grace, Vid, Phil, Sr., Marty, PD, Phil Jr., Bertha, Bo, continue to next list. Marty clicked his own name. An instant later, a floor plan appeared on the screen. In the southwest corner of bedroom 6 was a small gray square. He carried the gizmo from the bed over to the desk. The gray square moved across the little screen at the exact same pace he was walking. When he stopped, the square stopped. When he moved, the square moved. Weird, he said, opening the bedroom door and stepping out into the hallway. The gray square was now in the hallway. He knocked on Grace's door. There was no answer. He walked in. The gray square moved into bedroom 5. Very weird. He glanced at Grace's desk and saw that she had a gizmo identical to his. He sat on her bed and stared down at the gray square. How does the gizmo... He noticed the identification tag dangling from his neck and suddenly realized how it knew where he was. He clicked Grace's name. A blue square appeared in the library. Grace had stayed in her bedroom less than a minute before heading back downstairs, clutching the one-armed monkey for security, which she was badly in need of after the day's events. Mrs. Couts, her English teacher, had told her that if she was curious about someone, all she had to do was look at their books. You can read a person like a book by the books they read, was how Mrs. Couts puts it. And Grace was desperate to learn more about their guardian. She hadn't noticed it when she was in the library earlier, but along the walls beneath the balcony was a glass display case. In it was an ancient illuminated manuscript, hand-lettered on parchment, beautifully illustrated, and written in a language Grace had never seen before. She stood in front of the case for a long time, stared at the 2 open pages, trying to decipher the words, but she could make nothing of them, and finally turned away, walking up the spiral staircase to the library. Now these books I understand, she said. Grace loved reading science books, and Wolf had hundreds of them, carefully organized and labeled by subject. oceanography, geology, astronomy, meteorology, chemistry, mammals, birds. Marty will love this section, she thought, although I had better keep it to myself for the time being. He's already too excited about the island and wolf. Reptiles, fish, insects, dragons. Grace stopped. Dragons? She looked at the next section. It contained books on sea monsters. Next to this was lake monsters. Then a large section on Bigfoot and the Yeti. Then mermaids and mermen. Then little humanoids, which was divided into subsections. Fairies, leprechauns, gnomes, pixies, ogres, brownies, trolls, and finally elves. Oh no, Grace thought, with a racing heart. Wolf believes in Santa's helpers. If Mrs. Couch was right about the books a person reads, then her uncle was a lunatic. Grace completed the circle, stopped at the last section labeled General Cryptozoology. She looked back at the shelves she had passed. Clearly 3/4 of the books were about monstrous impossibilities. Why had their parents made Wolf their guardian? They couldn't have possibly known all about this. She pulled out a book called The Hidden Ones, a compendium of cryptids, and started to read. Introduction. Cryptozoology is the study of animals that are believed to exist but cannot be proven to exist scientifically. Cryptids are the rarest animals on Earth, hidden by their isolation and low numbers. Perhaps the best known examples are the Yeti, abominable snowman, in Asia, or the Sasquatch, Bigfoot, in North America. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other cryptids, of no lesser importance, scattered around the globe, waiting for scientific verification. These other cryptids include Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster of Scotland, the giant squid, or kraken, of which no living specimens have been found, the chupacabra, goatsucker, found in the American Southwest, Mexico, and Central America. Grace became so involved in the implausible subject that she didn't notice Marty walk into the library until he called her name. She thought about answering him, but instead she scooted farther into the shadows. On occasion, Marty loved to scare the daylights out of her by jumping from concealed places when she least expected it. She swore that one day she would pay him back. This just might be the day, she thought. Marty didn't see Grace anywhere, and was disappointed that the gizmo didn't work as he had thought. He slipped it into his pocket and walked over to the first aquarium for another look at the odd fish. Come on, Cop Lips, show me some life. He tapped on the glass. The fish didn't move. Grace rather liked watching Marty talk to himself, and decided not to give herself away. At least not yet. Marty got bored with the passive fish and wandered over to the squid tank. Hey, squids, it's Captain Nemo from the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But this time I'm bigger than you. When he finished berating the squid, he went over to the fireplace. He squatted down on the hearth and moved the embers around with a poker. Then he picked his nose and flicked the harvest into the flames. Grace covered her mouth to stop herself from laughing. Marty and Luther were always calling people nose pickers. Who was the nose picker now? Marty went back over to the aquarium for a final look at the fish. Tell you what I'll do, Cop Breath. If you show me just a little bit of personality, I'll scoop a squid out and feed it to you. He waited a full minute. Fine then, he said. No calamari for you. He headed for the door. Grace took a deep breath and was about to let out a blood-curdling yell, but changed her mind at the last second. She was comfortable sitting up on the balcony. It was the first time in nearly a week that she had felt reasonably content. She let him go, then slid out to the railing where the light was better, and returned to the Cryptid book. Laura Lee, 6. A woman came into the library, and once again Grace was distracted from her uncle's book. She closed it and quietly scooted back into the shadows. The woman was short, slender, fit-looking, and very tan, as if she'd been baked in an oven. She must be part of Uncle Travis' merry band of pirates. Grace guessed she had short red hair and wore running shorts and a tank top. Hanging on a chain around her neck was a yellow tag. Her feet were bare. She was carrying a black plastic bag, which she placed carefully on the table near the sofa. Although the woman was at least as old as her uncle, she moved like a much younger person. There was a lightness to her, something almost bird-like, that Grace found fascinating. Like Grace, the woman spent a long time before the glass case, staring down at the book, then walked over to the aquariums and looked at the occupants. When she finished, she took a deep breath, lifted her arms straight out from her sides, and started walking in a straight line, very slowly, one foot in front of the other, as if she were a gymnast, performing on a balance beam. Grace thought it must be some kind of yoga exercise. She walked all the way across the library in this manner, and was halfway back to the fireplace when she was interrupted by PD, running in, ready to do battle. "Aren't you adorable?" the woman said, ignoring the poodle's high-pitched yapping. She held her hands out, and PD surrendered unconditionally by jumping into them without the slightest hesitation. "You little coward," Grace thought. "Your bite is no bigger than you are." The woman was cuddling and cooing over the tiny canine when Wolf limped into the library without his cane, an angry scowl on his face. "I'm Dr. Travis Wolf," he said gruffly. "He acts as if he is going to make her walk the plank." Grace thought, if she's not one of his pirates, then who is she? The woman put PD down, seemingly unperturbed by Wolf's fierceness. "I'm pleased to meet you," she said. "My name is Dr. Laura Lee." "Snake," Wolf commanded, holding his pocket open, but the trick didn't work this time. PD gave a defiant bark, then jumped back into Laura's arms. Wolf's faces turned crimson. "She's fine. I love teacup poodles." Grace was beginning to really like Dr. Laura Lee. Wolf towered over her, but she wasn't in the least intimidated by him. "You're lucky you didn't die out there," Wolf said. Grace stifled a gasp of surprise. This was the person in the red kayak. I would have been fine, Dr. Lee said. You would have been crushed on the rocks, Wolf said loudly. My people risked their lives picking you up, and ruined our helicopters in the process. I spent the last of my cash renting the kayak, she responded easily. So if you're suggesting I reimburse you for the rescue, you're out of luck. I'm suggesting no such thing. It's just, well, what were you doing out there? Dr. Lee did not answer his question. Instead, she walked over to the aquarium and looked at the fish. Again, Petey barked at them. These are very interesting specimens, she said. Very primitive looking. Coelacanths, aren't they? Of course, Grace thought, just like the name of the ship. The fish were discovered in South America by a woman named Marjorie Courtney Latimer in 1938. Dr. Lee continued. She went down to the wharf to see if the fishermen had brought in anything she might be able to put in her small natural history museums. On the deck of one of the boats was a fish very much like these. That fish turned out to be the find of the century, a living fossil, a cryptid if you will, a fish that was supposed to have died along with the dinosaurs. Wolf's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Are you a reporter? Dr. Lee laughed. Hardly. I'm a cultural anthropologist. And to answer your question about what I was doing out on the water in a kayak, I was coming to see you, Dr. Wolf. Why? I'll get to that soon enough, but first I have some questions for you. For me, Wolf sputtered. Why? Tell me about Noah Blackwood, she interrupted. Wolf stared at her in complete surprise. Grace was surprised too. Noah Blackwood was a famous conservationist. He had his own television show and several animal theme parks around the world called Noah's Ark. Marty and Luther were big fans and watched his show all the time. Even Dr. Beazles approved of Noah Blackwood. He had taken their class to the Noah's Ark in Paris on a school field trip. What does Noah Blackwood have to do with your coming here? Wolf asked. What's your relationship with him? Wolf gave a harsh laugh. We have no relationship, unless you considered being enemies a relationship. Rivals perhaps? Ridiculous. But he did work for him, briefly, a long time ago, and even then we weren't exactly fond of each other. Why? Dr. Lee asked. You are a reporter, Wolf said. I swear I'm not. But before I tell you why I'm here, I need to know more about you and Noah Blackwood. I've already made a terrible mistake with Dr. Blackwood, and I'm not about to make another one. Wolf stared at her for a few moments, then squatted down in front of the hearth and put a log on the fire. When he stood up, his attitude seemed to have softened a little. Okay, he said. What do you want to know? Who is he? What do you mean? I know he's one of the world's foremost conservationists. I've talked to a lot of people about him, and to a person, they had nothing but praise for his work. I watched a couple of his television shows, and I have to say he's an impressive man. But there seems something beneath the surface. Something I don't know. Something hidden, I guess. Wolf looked at her. You're very perceptive. Have you met him? No, I did manage to talk to him on the telephone a couple of times. It was pleasant enough, but there was something. Noah Blackwood is a man absolutely void of love or compassion, Wolf interrupted. He lives totally for himself and his selfish needs. That's certainly not the personality he portrays on television. I didn't say he wasn't intelligent or charming, Wolf said. He's both. But he's not a conservationist. That image is nothing more than a clever mask he wears to get what he wants. A wolf in sheep's clothing? Something like that. As a renowned conservationist, Blackwood can go into the woods and do anything he wants. If there's a question about his activities, he puts on his conservation mask and the doubts and questions vanish into thin air. Noah Blackwood would never do anything to harm an animal. The notion is outrageous. At least that's how the thinking goes. What kind of activities? Noah Blackwood is a collector, Wolf said. His parks are nothing more than holding areas so he can make money off the animals before he harvests them. Harvest? Wolf made a throat-slitting motion with his index finger. You're certain of this? Absolutely certain. I've seen some of his so-called trophies. He has mounts that would turn the Smithsonian Natural History Museum green with envy, and I suspect that the stuffed animals are just the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Lee shook her head in disgust. Can we sit down? I'm feeling a little ill. Of course, Wolf moved some of the pillows on the sofa and they sat down. Petey seemed very content to stay in Dr. Lee's lap. Now what's this all about? I'm not trying to be obstinate, Dr. Lee said, but I still need a little more information about you and Noah before I can tell you. Wolf sighed and gave her a reluctant nod. What did you do for Noah? I caught a great white shark for him, Wolf said. Grace wasn't certain she had heard correctly. She moved a little closer to the railing. Petey looked up at the balcony and started barking. Grace froze and held her breath, hoping they would discover her. Dr. Lee laughed. I guess she doesn't like sharks. She doesn't. But I don't think that's what she's barking about. He looked toward the balcony. Dr. Lee calmed PD down by scratching her head. And to Grace's relief, the poodle stopped barking, and Wolf continued his story. After I graduated from veterinary school, Noah hired me to catch a great white for his Seattle Ark. At the time, no one had ever been able to keep a great white alive long enough to put it on display. Or since I understand, Dr. Lee said. I read about this when I was looking into Blackwood's considerable accomplishments, but I don't recall seeing your name in connection with the shark. Blackwood was not into sharing the glory, Wolf said, which was fine with me. He paid us $500,000 for that great white. Us? A friend of mine from college, named Ted Bronson, helped me. Ted knew virtually nothing about animals, but he knew everything there was to know about electronics and computers, which was a tremendous help. Ted is your partner in E-Wolf now? Yes. Wolf got up and started pacing. You see, the problem isn't catching great whites, it's transporting them. They either die on the way or within a few days after being put into the aquarium. Ted and I invented a shark transport box. The whole thing was computerized. Water flow, temperature, oxygenation. The box was a thing of beauty. We managed to catch a 14-foot great white and brought it to Blackwood's Seattle's Ark. It lived for 5 years, and people lined up for miles to see it. I bet Noah had made $10 million off that fish. And you only got $500,000? It was enough for me to get out of Blackwood's clutches, Wolf said, and enough for Ted and me to start Ewolf. Blackwood wanted us to go out and catch more great whites for his other arcs. We refused. He wanted to buy our transport box, but we wouldn't sell it to him. Why not? Laura asked. It's not as if great whites are endangered. If I'd stayed at Noah's Ark, I would have been hooked just like that great white. I caught for Blackwood, Wolf answered, like everyone else who works for him. And if I'd sold him the box, he would have used it to transport endangered animals for his private collection. He would have used me. Mrs. Coutts is right, Grace thought. You can learn a lot by looking at the books a person reads, but you can learn even more by hiding among them. As Wolf recounted his capture of the great white shark, he was transformed into a different person. His lip was less pronounced, and a gleam came into his eyes that had not been there before. So when you left the park, what did you do? Dr. Lee asked. Got Ewolf up and running with Ted. Then Wolf hesitated. You went to Lake Tele. Dr. Lee finished the sentence for him. There was a long enough silence. Grace could hear the snap of the logs burning in the fireplace. Finally, Wolf said, there are only a handful of people who knew about the Lake Tele expedition. He locked his brown eyes on her. And you didn't learn about it by checking my background, Dr. Lee. There's no record of that expedition anywhere. You're right, Dr. Lee opened her plastic bag and removed a cardboard box. She took several crumpled newspapers from the box, then very carefully pulled out a large greenish egg. Wolf gently took the egg from her, which filled up both his giant hands, and carried it over to the laboratory bench, where he examined it for some time, before whispering, as if a loud voice might break the shell. Where did you get this? I stole it. From whom? From Noah Blackwood. Where did he get it? From me, I'm afraid. Wolf gave her a quizzical look. Grace didn't understand either. What was Dr. Lee talking about? 3 months ago, she continued, I was living with a group of pygmies near Lake Tele in the Congo, and I met an old friend of yours. Masalito? Wolf asked in surprise. Dr. Lee nodded. I thought they were an uncontacted tribe, but I learned that you had gotten there 14 years before me. He gave this to you? A going-away present. As I said before, I've been out in the field for years. Lake Tele was to be my last field project for a while. I had decided to return to the States and teach at a small private university in Florida. I thought it was time to share what I'd learned from the indigenous people I'd met around the world. She stood and walked over to the fire, still cradling PD in her arms. But the plan changed when Masaleto gave me that egg. Did he tell you where he got it? He said it came from the nest of Mokalele Mbembe. Must be some kind of rare bird, Grace thought. Wolf shook his head. There is no Mokalele Mbembe. Not anymore. Masalito said you might feel that way. Did he tell you why? Yes, in fact, he told me quite a bit about his friend Wolf. I bet he did, Wolf said. Look, I'm not saying the egg didn't come from Mokalele Mbembe, but it's obviously very old. He gave the egg a gentle shake. It's brittle, and there are some pieces missing. It could have been laid decades ago and preserved somehow. Masalito insists that Mokalele Mbembe is alive after you left. He found a nest with 3 eggs. 2 of the eggs hatched. You're holding the 3rd. Really, Wolf gently set the egg back into the box and joined Dr. Lee in front of the fire. What happened to the 2 that hatched? The male died last year before I arrived at Lake Tele. The female is still alive, but she is not well. Did you see her? Dr. Lee shook her head. I begged Masalito to take me to her, but he refused. You said that he had promised you that he would never show Mokele Mbembe to anyone. Wolf nodded. Masalito has always been a man of his word. He squatted down and stared, poking at the fire again, then looked up at Dr. Lee. Okay, it's your turn. And you can start by explaining how Blackwood fits into all of this. Fair enough, Dr. Lee said. When I got back to the States, I started looking into Mokele Mbembe. I showed the egg to a few colleagues, and they suggested I send it to GeneArc Laboratories to have it analyzed. Wolf cursed and stood. Blackwood's lab. I had no funding, Dr. Lee said, and they offered to analyze the egg for free. Of course they did, Wolf started pacing again. Noah Blackwood lives for unusual samples. God knows what he's doing with that genetic material. My sister and brother-in-law were going to look into it, but they were... He paused. Grace was stunned. Her parents hadn't said a word about this. In fact, she couldn't remember them ever mentioning Noah Blackwood's name. I read about the crash, Dr. Lee said. Is there any word? No, Wolf said quietly. Wolf walked back over to the sofa and sat down, heavily. Dr. Lee joined him. Believe me, she said, I wouldn't have taken the egg to GeneArc if I had known what I know now about Blackwood. Tell me what happened, Wolf said. Several weeks went by, and I didn't hear a word from them. So I called. They told me they had lost the egg. In a pig's eye, Wolf said. After several tries, I finally got a hold of Blackwood, and he told me that it would turn up eventually, and that I shouldn't be concerned. The preliminary results was that it was nothing more than an old ostrich egg. That egg looks no more like an ostrich egg than I do, Wolf said. Did you tell him where you got the egg? No. Did you tell him what you thought the egg was? No. Well, at least you did that right. I'm afraid there's more to it, Dr. Lee said. She went on to explain that her apartment and office had been broken into. All of her field notes were stolen. The day after the break-in, I was fired from the university without explanation. My bank account was mysteriously emptied, and all of my credit cards were cancelled. Wolf closed his eyes and shook his head. That has Blackwood written all over it, he said. Is he really that powerful? Wolf nodded. Masalito is mentioned on nearly every page of my Lake Tele notebooks, Dr. Lee said miserably. Noel Blackwood had his henchmen break into your apartment and office, Wolf said. He had you fired with a simple phone call. He is one of the wealthiest men in the world, and he doesn't hesitate to use his money and influence to get what he wants. You can't imagine the things he's tried to do to me over the years. He couldn't afford to have you running around telling people about Mokele Mbembe, or pursuing the mystery on your own. He arranged for you to lose your job, to cripple you. That's how he operates. You're lucky he didn't have you killed. Grace found this difficult to believe. It was hard to picture the smiling, friendly television face of Noah Blackwood as that of a murderer. Why would anyone make such a fuss over an old bird egg? How did you get the egg back? Wolf asked. I broke into the lab and stole it back. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to find my field notes. A security guard interrupted my search. I told him I was the cleaning lady. I smuggled the egg out of the lab in a mop bucket. Wolf laughed. You don't look like a cleaning lady, Dr. Lee. Laurel smiled. Thank you, and please call me Laurel. Of course, and you can call me Wolf. Your field notes were probably sent directly to Blackwood anyway. I'm certain he's combing the country for you and that egg right now. I think he might have caught up to me in Utah. Someone smashed my engine and ransacked my camper while I was in a store. I had to hitchhike the rest of the way out here. Wolf gave her a look of open admiration. I shouldn't have taken it to Geenock, Laura said. Wolf patted her hand. Forget about it. The question now is, what do we do about it? Blackwood has no doubt already sent a team to Lake Tele, and the timing stinks. He got up and started pacing again. My niece and nephew just got here today. Twins. I was going to spend the next few weeks getting to know them and settling them in. He gave a bitter laugh. The irony is that I was going to take them there eventually. But I sure can't take them on this trip. Take them where? Laura asked. What are you talking about? Grace was asking the same questions herself. Wolf stopped. It will take a few days to get ready, but you and I, Dr. Lee, are going to Lake Tele. Why would Wolf want to take us to the Congo? Grace thought with alarm. On more than one occasion, Masalito saved my life, Wolf continued. I'm not going to leave him out there for Blackwood's jackals to devour. We have to find him before they do. I'm not sure I'll be able to join you, Laurel said. I need to start looking for a job. You have a job, Wolf said. I just hired you. As what? You're my new chief anthropologist. Dr. Lee gave him a grateful smile. I guess I have no choice but to accept, under the circumstances. But what about your niece and nephew? Wolf frowned. I might have to send them back to their boarding school. There's no time to arrange anything else. Grace nearly let out a cheer. What if Blackwood's men get to Lake Tele before us? They will, Wolf answered. But we still have to have an advantage. What's that? I know Marcelito's phone number, and they don't. What are you talking about? Marcelito doesn't have a phone. Is the Malamo still there? Yes, Little said. It's on the roof. What roof? What kind of animal were they talking about now? Grace thought. Good, Wolf said. Let's go find Phil and start figuring out what we'll need for the expedition. After they had gone, Grace pulled out the hidden ones and looked up Mukele Mbembe. It was not a bird.